John Major says there could be 24. Jacques Delors says there could be 30 countries in the new Europe. But either way, what place will there be for Scotland? Rockstar Fish, singing of Scotland's predicament and taking the message to young people here and abroad in an interview with MTV.
You know, people are suddenly starting to go, well, maybe we could handle it on ourselves, and maybe, you know, we should take the break. And it's just trying to break through the apathy, and that's what the song's about. And like I say, I mean, especially with Europe, and we're talking about having discussions around, you know, European tables where we're actually relying on putting our voice through somebody in Westminster who really doesn't have any idea what this country's about in the first place, you know. It's all like, you know, well, I was up there for a weekend and, you know, it seems to be all right, and I think this is what the Scots want. And I don't like this idea of the image of a little boy tugging at his dad's shirt trying to get attention, which is what Scotland is, that is the position that Scotland's faced with at the moment.
If what Fish believes is to come to pass, then we'll see changes here at the European Parliament. There will be changes in the relationship between Scotland and the UK, and not only changes in that relationship, but many small countries like Malta or Latvia will also change their status and relationship with the EC. And what of the countries which at present don't have a state, like Catalonia or Euskadi? But how many of the newly independent countries in Eastern Europe will agree to share sovereignty with the EC? Latvia, for example, will it give up its hard-won sovereignty in order to pool its resources with the EC to better its economic prospects?
It's early days. It's hard to say. I don't think that we would be keen to surrender our sovereignty now that we've regained it. I think our cultural and national identities have been suppressed for so long that at the moment what we want to do is to enjoy them.
The Ukraine is different. It's decided to go for membership. But when?
Ukraine is now standing on the road of independence with respect to economic and political plans. We have to set up our own Ukrainian currency, have economic independence, and become an equal member of the general economic community. We have in mind, firstly, to balance our overall economic commitments, both with the East and with the West, to come out of this situation fully, effectively, and rationally for the benefit of the Ukraine. When we give attention to these economic affairs, then perhaps we will enter more strongly into economic ties with both Eastern and Western Europe. And we can raise our standards of production to the higher European level. Only then, perhaps, will the European community recognize us as being a possible member of their community. That's why we have these beliefs that we will quickly become a member of the European community.
In the European Parliament just now, the talk is all about the outcome of the summit meeting at Maastricht next month. Will the new Europe be the looser, wider confederation favoured by John Major, or is it more likely to be a tighter political federation along the lines of the United States or Canada? Europe is trying to decide what sort of constitutional framework it will have. What lessons can we learn in Europe from the Canadian experience, given that we also have differing identities, differing languages, differing sizes of units that have to be accommodated?
Well, I'm loath as a Canadian to say that you have to follow our example, but I think there are lessons that can be learned, especially because we are one of the few federations that contains different linguistic groups. The Quebecers would say different nationalities. and so on, whereas the United States or Australia or Germany are relatively homogeneous federations. And I think what we've learned in that process is that you have to have two things. You have to have sufficient, in our case provincial, in Europe's case member state autonomy, to accommodate the differences, but you also have to have sufficient strength at the center to provide the cement and the glue to hold the federation together.
But what part will Scotland play in this brave new Europe? Unlike Slovenia, Latvia, or even the Ukraine, we have no sovereignty yet to share. So how will we express the community identity that Fish sings about and others agonise about? Scots already play a part in the European community, as civil servants in the Commission, MEPs and local authority lobbyists. But eventually it could be more than that, because the Scottish Secretary is joining other leaders in backing proposals at next month's summit at Maastricht for a committee of the regions of Europe to have a direct voice in community affairs. But what kind of voice?
I would have thought that its best role would be at a pre-legislative stage, but of course it's yet to be set up. It's only a proposal yet. So you're really talking about only a puff of smoke at the moment. You can't actually define it. And I think because there is much to play for in the shape of it, the British government is taking a good positive attitude towards it. I would have envisaged that this is a body which could give advice on what sort of legislation is needed, on the form of community legislation, but only advice. Now, at the moment, I mean, to take Scotland as a very good example, there is direct contact between the Scottish Office and the European Commission in the administration of European regional policy, the disbursement of funds. And I wouldn't have thought that the regional committee, for want of a better term, would have interfered in that process. I would have thought as long as it remains a consultative body, it could be set up as a perfectly effective institution. Because once it's set up, it'll probably want to do more than that, and then you'd have all sorts of arguments, particularly, I think, with the European Parliament, because, of course, the Parliament has a very distinct role in the legislative chain. And if such a consultative committee started to try to usurp that power, then you would probably have a much greater head-to-head confrontation with the Parliament than the other two institutions.
When we talk about this European Consultative Council or Committee of the Regions, why do we automatically talk about Scotland and not about the Highland region of Scotland, the Borders region of Scotland? Because if it's going to scrutinise ideas for legislation, then shouldn't, in fact, the scrutiny be undertaken by people closest to a geographical region?
Well, the people who represent the member states on that committee will have to be drawn, if it's to be effective, will have to be drawn from the main lines of need within each member state. I mean, the proposal is that the UK will have 24 members on this committee. Now, by my arithmetic, if you use the balance of the European Parliament, that would give Scotland 2.5 members. Now, that would presumably, COSLA would presumably be invited to propose who went. Now, that could mean that either the representation would be done on a highly political basis, which would be useless, probably, or it could be done on a needs and geographical basis, so that you've got somebody representing the big urban interests and somebody representing the rural interests, and perhaps somebody else in between.
However it's organised, there are people in Europe who would like the regions to play a much stronger part than presently envisaged. Others, like the Basques, see plans for a Europe of the regions getting in the way of much greater aspirations.
Yes, well, I think the Europe of the regions is more an economic euphemism for letting things stand as they are, which is basically don't talk about independence in Europe. Europe is already achieving a high degree of regionalism, but this regionalism doesn't change at all the structures of states and their compositions. States are free to organize themselves as they wish, and that doesn't account and doesn't accommodate for the claims of nationalists in Scotland or in the Basque Country or in Catalonia, who say that they are a nation, they are a people, and not just a region. By calling it a region, it's watered down into the business type of economics, which is, of course, an important element also in the European community, but it is not the way we should be shaping the European communities.
The 12 member states of the EC have equality of status, regardless of size or economic importance. But can this legal and political status quo remain if such widely diverse countries as the Ukraine, Sweden, Malta and Scotland become members also?
The world you and I are living is a world full of oddities. For example, there is a religion that is at the same time a state, like the Catholic religion. By the same reasoning, all other religions could say, I should have a seat at the United Nations or a seat at the Council of Europe. Or simply a state should say, that is a very small state and only by the category of size, I should be a member of the EC, and that state, because it's so small, shouldn't be. I think the question is very, very complex, and there will be always things like that, the same way that evolution has provided for large animals to die, small animals to survive, and the kind of variety we have in the world we live in.
David Martin, what sort of anomaly is Scotland inside the EC just now? What status do we have?
I'm not sure we're an anomaly, but we, of course, are represented in the European community at the present time through the United Kingdom, so we have our voice in the Council of Ministers through the UK representation. We have, as your film rightly says, our representation inside the Commission through permanent civil servants, and at the present time with Bruce Milan as one of the European Commissioners, and we have our MEPs in the Parliament. I suppose where we're different from some parts of the European community is that Scotland is a nation, although it's not a nation state. So it doesn't have its voice in the Council of Ministers as a nation. But the fact that it's a nation state is recognised by the community in a number of other fields. For example, when we're looking at education, Scotland, having its distinct education system, has representatives in the specialist working groups putting forward the Scottish point of view. But as a nation, a separate nation, of course, we're not recognised in the European community because we're not a separate nation.
What about the law? Neil MacCormick, aren't we recognised as separate in that respect?
Not very effectively. We do have one Scottish judge at the moment in one of the European courts, David Edward, who used to be professor at Edinburgh University, but our legal system is actually very imperfectly recognised even within the court structure, and despite the presence of Scottish judges in the EC. And this is inevitably the case because, as David says, the United Kingdom is represented as the UK as a nation state within Europe. For some purposes we succeed in getting recognition of our own legal system, but by and large Britain is represented through English law unless a special effort is made to the contrary.
Right. Is it exaggerating the status of the Länder in Germany, like Bavaria, like Schleswig-Holstein, like Hamburg perhaps, to say that they somehow have more representation in the European community directly than we have?
No, I don't think it's exaggeration. That comes partly from the German political system, whereby the federal government at least draws part of its own legitimacy from the existence of the Länder. And so the Länder have constitutional rights entrenched within the German constitution, which allows them to play a stronger role at the European level. For example, a German minister will always be accompanied at Council of Ministers meetings by a representative of the Länder, so that the Länder's point of view can be put forward inside the Council. So they're firstly there in a political sense as part of the Council. They're also there in terms of representations offices, and sometimes the nature of these offices are put down rather unfairly. They really are political offices. They're not there simply as lobby offices looking for money or a bit of recognition. They're there with real political clout, speaking to commissioned civil servants on a day-to-day basis about the developments of the community.
Real political clout?
I think one should come in on that. I think they do have at least significant political influence, but not, of course, real political power like members of the Council of Ministers themselves. Also, of course, insofar as Bavaria or any of the other Länder is there, they're there with their own political representatives of their own choosing, whereas whenever Scotland turns up with a ministerial representative at the moment, it's Mr. Lang with his rather small band of elected representatives in Scotland, so that what we get in the way of representation through the UK is, at present anyway, the direct reverse of what we vote for. And in the same way, although we have, as David Martin pointed out, our own parliamentary representation, it's about half the share of what an equivalent population in Denmark gets in terms
Right.
of numbers of members. I think we have very little political say at all in Europe. Need more.
I'll come on to that later, but there's one thing I wanted to ask David Martin first of all. We've talked quite a lot about Maastricht. You know, it's a summit. They're going to try to decide what sort of new Europe we're going to have. Is there anything on that agenda which has particular relevance for Scotland?
Yes, there's one very important item on the Maastricht agenda which will give Scotland this voice directly into the European institutions that Neil's correctly saying that we need, and that is the creation of a consultative assembly of the regions, whereby the regions will be represented within the community institutions so that they have a direct voice. The importance of that, of course, the Council will still be the key institution, but the importance of that will be that Scotland will not be represented by a Conservative, but will be represented in the current situation by a Labour representative.
I think we'll take up that one a bit later on in the programme. Because whatever the new status of Scotland will be, Europe is going to enlarge, and it will need some sort of regional tier of government most likely. But will it be the regions themselves or the new countries in the European community that precipitate structural change? In Baden-Württemberg and the other German Länder, there's already an existing regional blueprint. The bridge over the Rhine behind me marks the boundary between France and Germany, two countries which have already started to build the new Europe sans frontières. There are no custom posts open now on either side of the bridge. On this side of the river, Germany, people are quite used to federated government, the sharing of power between regional and national governments. On the other side of the river, in France, people have a quite different concept of how regions should share in the policy making of any government. How will the new Europe determine which powers should be exercised at regional level?
It is clear that there will be regions, and there are already regions which are greater than, let's say, Luxembourg. And so the question of their political weight or expression is probably now on the negotiation table. Probably there will be no answer at this stage. Maybe some sort of a new institution, but rather like the European and Social Council giving advices, no further.
But some Euro MPs have suggested that the German Länder, like Bavaria, will want to extend their regional status if Scotland, for example, becomes a member country.
I don't think so. They will stay in the status they have in the German constitution, because the German constitution is a part of the European community and still exists, this constitution, as long as it's not changed by a decision of the German people. But perhaps in a long time, I don't know how long it is, it may become a harmonization one day, but it's a different status of all these parts of Europe. Don't give it immediately for a common same position.
In Brussels, the new Euro Parliament is being built to accommodate more member states, although too many new countries will not be welcomed by either right or left in the present Parliament. But should the Scots opt for national status, the Germans at any rate seem resigned to the idea.
If the Scottish people would vote for that, and if a separation is allowed due to the rules of the Constitution of the United Kingdom, it's up to them. In that case, I would be willing to start a debate, if it makes sense or not. Anyway, if it happens, I can't imagine that Scotland would be excluded from the European community. Why? There is no reason for it.
If the Scots vote to sit in the Euro Parliament as equal partners, even if the Bavarians don't, will that have a knock-on effect on Catalan national aspirations? Would that jolt Heribert Barrera's nation into claiming independence in Europe?
There is no unanimity on this point, because in Catalonia the people who comes from the south, immigration, they are very many. And at the present moment, only in the polls, 40% is asking for independence.
What would happen to opinion in Catalonia if Malta succeeded in becoming a full member state?
If Malta succeeds, I think that it will encourage Catalan people to pursue in this climb to be as a state in the community. I suppose that the end of the process will be successful, but I don't foresee that will be very fast.
David Martin, is that not the whole essence of this debate about whether or not there are going to be more regions in Europe, what powers are going to have, what new nations are going to become members? Is it not just purely political? And that's how the decisions will be arrived at.
Well, of course it's political, and we are talking about real power here. And the whole drive of the European community, though, is to make the nation-state less important and to make the European dimension stronger. My argument is that the parallel of that should be a Europe of the regions. That if you have a European Union, far from being contradictory, increasing the power of the regions is actually a balance to that European Union. We can't really keep the present position in the European community where every member state would be entitled to a commissioner, where every country would have a seat, in some cases in equal terms in the Council of Ministers or with weighted votes, but even the weighted votes don't reflect the differences in population. That couldn't survive in a community with 20, 24, 30 member states. And I think what you would see happening is if Malta, Luxembourg, Cyprus all had their seat at the table, I think, as your film indicates, countries like Bavaria, Scotland would want their own representation. But it'd be a Senate of the regions, not of the nation states. Bavaria wouldn't get its seat at the expense of breaking up Germany, in my opinion.
That's what I wanted to make clear, because all of the German MEPs, regardless of which party they were in, made this quite clear, that there was no push in Bavaria for Bavaria to become an independent country. But I must pick away at this Europe of the regions, because is it not true that the sort of structure which is envisaged just now would mean that Scotland was represented not as Scotland, but perhaps by our own regions, like Highlands or Borders, or perhaps Lothians. And that's what we're really talking about when we talk about a Europe of the regions.
No, I don't think so, because if you are talking about a European community with a population, let's guess, of around 400 million people, it's very, very feasible. You're not talking about units of much less than 5 million having representation, other than the historical anomalies that we mentioned of the Maltas and the Cypruses and so on. So I think you see Scotland identified as a region, and no insult is intended by the term region. It's a level below the existing nation states. So we'd be represented at a Scottish level in this Council of the Regions.
Neil MacCormick, what do you make of that? Given that you heard Heribert Barrera, the Catalan, saying there's no great push in Catalonia just now. But on the other hand, if Malta becomes an independent country inside Europe, then we Catalans will probably also seek independence.
Well, that's right. Clearly, Europe is evolving. It's an evolving kind of political order. And clearly, there are two elements in this evolution. One, as David is saying, is the development of regions, although interestingly, regions which will be defined internally to themselves by the member states, not externally by Europe and nation states. And it may be that some places will find that their best future is found by getting increased regional recognition, whereas others may evolve or choose towards seeking nation state, the condition of nation states.
Right, let's take this Council of Europe, because you've said it will come about, although perhaps not in the way that you would want it to, because it will be a creature of the Council of Ministers, and so therefore theoretically under their direction. But how do they decide throughout Europe what the representation will be? Because unless there's some sort of uniformity of representation, presumably that council wouldn't be worth a row of beans. It wouldn't be able to move on to actual decision-making and policy-making.
One of your contributors to the film made the point that nothing is even in the European community, that it's a unique institution. It has lots of different animals making up this institution. The only way we could solve initially this problem, this question of representation of the regions, is to have one simple criteria. Those who are elected to that council will have to be directly elected politicians at the sub-nation state level. And you're right, because of the diversity of the community, it would be impossible to put any other criteria down at this stage.
Right.
But
David Martin, I apologise for cutting you off in full stream. Last word, Neil MacCormick.
Putting Scotland down as a sub-nation state will never do.
Not in Scottish International, it won't. But first of all, the European community must decide how many countries will get to sit round the table. And we Scots will have to decide how to fit in. The poor poor of the world are knocking at the door of wealthy Western Europe. But do we let them in? That's next Tuesday at 6:30.